The original Bioshock was a huge jump in storytelling for the type of game that it was, as a sort of hybrid of shooter, stealth game, RPG that actually had a pretty heavy focus on the mechanics of itself. Story wasn't really considered to be something high on the list of expectations for it, but it was a huge priority for the developers of the game. So do the gameplay and story tie together to give Bioshock a good ending? Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx we asked the question, what did you think about Bioshock's ending? I just want to start off by saying I have problems with the ending of Bioshock. I think it's a great game, I enjoy the hell out of it, and I think it's one of the seminal moments in gaming history, but the ending. When Bioshock was originally created, Ken Levine did not want to have multiple endings for it. He wanted to have one ambiguous ending where you weren't really sure about how everything worked out, like where the characters ended up, what the fate of Rapture was, etc. And really the only thing that changes in the ending, more so, is the fate of the little sisters, little girls who have basically been enslaved to harvest Adam. Adam is a resource that the story of Bioshock depends on a lot. It's essentially why anyone has any kind of superpowers, so to speak, but we won't go any further for the sake of simplicity. In my opinion, talking about that element of the story doesn't really make a lot of sense, as it really doesn't change a lot materially speaking. Either you're good or bad, and you either end up with a family and happy or not. The more stationary elements of the ending, however, are more interesting to me, because you would think the game was coming to a close when you walk into Andrew Ryan's office. Andrew Ryan feels essentially as if he is the antagonist of the game. He started Rapture, he was pretty brutal, the workers rebelled against him because he was unfair and awful. His ideas were generally looked at as bad, and his actions, when they failed, were also generally looked at as bad. By all accounts, he seemed like the bad guy, and as part of a twist, he wasn't the big bad guy. That turned out to be Frank Fontaine, rival businessman and essentially the cause of much of the strife in Rapture. Although one could say that he didn't actually have the worst motives, he also didn't have genuine motives. He was essentially in it for himself, but he assumed multiple identities, including revolutionary leader Atlas. Ultimately, a revolution took place which didn't leave the city in a good condition, let's just say. Part of what's so interesting about Bioshock is that Andrew Ryan sucks. The revolution was pretty much justified and should have happened, and yet it didn't actually make anything better. Although things were on a downturn and Andrew Ryan was pretty much making things bad anyway, it just accelerated all that. If the entire arc of the ending had been based around this, I think that it would have been a lot more successful of an ending. I don't think that it would have had to have been ambiguous to be a good ending. In fact, I think it would have made more sense to talk about Rapture as a city and talk about how all things, including the right actions, can be used by a bad actor to enrich themselves. And that's exactly what Frank Fontaine intended to do, but what we ended up with is nothing like that. What we end up with is a personal cap of an ending for a character that doesn't really have a lot of grounding in the actual story. You, Jack, the protagonist, end up being the illegitimate son of Andrew Ryan. You are brainwashed and ended up acting as sort of a robot assassin, and your choices don't actually influence the game. They influence whether or not you ended up having a family and being happy. And yes, there are some implications in the quote-unquote bad ending about nuclear bombs, but I wonder if it was there just to try to make it a little bit more interesting, knowing that Ken Levine really didn't want to go the route that he went with the multiple endings. More puzzling is the structure of how the current ending plays out. What we ultimately end up getting instead of an actual climax is new exposition that changes the context of your actions throughout the game. Andrew Ryan contextualizes the entire game as an on-rails experience and ultimately makes some pretty good metaphorical comparisons to the idea of a video game itself and the whole would you kindly brainwashing / assassin scenario. But you would think that from there we would springboard into a much larger, more world-oriented turn of events. Remember, you're kind of a faceless character. In the meantime, the city, the environment, the highlight of the game, the setting of the roller coaster, the thing that honestly has gotten so many people interested in Bioshock, Rapture, the city, didn't really get the kind of attention it should. By this time in the game, we know what Frank Fontaine did. He essentially astroturfed his way into a revolution that he controlled and could profit from, and we basically understood Andrew Ryan as well. We kind of just had some drawn-out sequences like becoming a big daddy, which is not a bad sequence, might I add. It just feels like it didn't belong between the most interesting part of the game and the final boss, which has its own issues itself. I mean, let's just talk about the final boss of Frank Fontaine. He's pumped himself full of Adam, he's super powerful, you use the opposite power that he's using at the time, and eventually you kill him. Almost feels tacked on. The game feels like its ending happens way before the end, if that makes sense. No, I'm not saying the game absolutely had to end with Andrew Ryan. Like I brought up in the beginning, the actual fate of Rapture, what consequences your actions as the player had on the overall world under the ocean, learning that stuff would be infinitely more interesting. A lot of the things that honestly would have gone great between Andrew Ryan dying and the credits, we had to find. We had to learn through audio logs that weren't necessarily enjoyable to find. It was work to actually hear the entire story of the game. It presents a problem, and it also doesn't present the information at the time that it would be most interesting, which, like I said, is after Andrew Ryan dying. You learned about the revolution going on, not necessarily who was controlling it, but about the specifics long before any of that shit went down. And it does make obvious some of the issues of presenting a story that happened after the main event that defines the world. You have to continually expect all of the characters to understand that event and to contextualize that event for the players through their experience. I just think the instant that you find out what's going on from Andrew Ryan, it shouldn't be a bunch of slow-paced stuff and then a big boss. This is the climax of the game, and it is not the climax of the game. There are a lot of sequences much earlier in the game that are much more interesting than this stretch of the game. And this stretch of the game is what you leave Rapture thinking about, which sucks. Now, I don't want to sit here and crap on everything done during this part of the game. There are things that I like. There's dialogue even from the Frank Fontaine boss that I find interesting, but I can't help feel that it could have been done so much better. Bioshock didn't give us the idea of games as art, but it certainly expanded that idea to the mainstream. However, it doesn't seem like it was treated as art once you got about 75% through the game. The ending of Bioshock isn't terrible, it's just kind of disappointing. The game itself is such a big piece of the gaming world, and you can feel the influence of Bioshock in almost any narrative-oriented game today. Looking back, it's just much more fun to play the game until you get to Andrew Ryan and hit him with a golf club and then stop. But hey, it's a hell of a ride up to that point, isn't it? What do you think of the Bioshock ending? We're sure there's a pretty big diversity of opinions on this issue, so we'll meet you in the comments. Let us know. If you like this video, please click the like button, and if you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week, and the best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription. As always, thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at Falcon the Hero. We'll see you next time, right here on gameranx.